Okay, can I go ahead?
Sure.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Thomas, and I am one of the executive members of MASWO. MASWO is a community-based professional association of social workers of Malayali descent in Ontario. MASWO has almost 300 members at this time. MASWO members work in diverse branches of social work practices such as child welfare, community mental health, hospital settings, and so on, with various organizations across Ontario. MASWO's key focus is ongoing professional development of our members and using our talents to make our communities to achieve their fullness. MASWO has several activities and programs in this regard. On behalf of MASWO executive team, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this important program. Today, we are gathered virtually to celebrate the Black History Month. Black History Month is celebrated in Canada in February to honor the achievements of the Black people and their valuable contributions to our society. It is also an occasion to talk about the struggles and challenges they encountered and the fights they won towards ending racial discriminations and social injustice over centuries. The historical oppression and discrimination experienced by the Black diaspora in North America is matchless in many ways. Every day, we hear stories about how systemically the Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities are targeted and brutally treated by the law enforcement bodies and the criminal justice system. Every day, we hear stories about the encounters of the Black and Indigenous families with the child welfare system, overrepresentation of Black children in care. Black children are unjustly treated and denied opportunities in our educational system. Inequitable health and economic outcomes in communities of Black and visible minorities. Their underrepresentation in managerial and decision making bodies. These realities clearly indicate that a radical reset is inevitably required in our system. As we all know, the relentless fight of Black community for systemic changes have brought diversity, equity, and inclusion to the center of contemporary discourses, especially in policy making. This is a good start. However, we have a long way to go to become a fully equitable and inclusive society. Therefore, the Black History Month is also an occasion to have critical and meaningful conversations on furthering the changes and exploring pathways for unified actions among the racialized communities. The Black History Month reminds us of the indisputable fact that a great deal of the social advantages we enjoy as brown bodies today in this country are the outcomes of the historical fights of our Black brothers and sisters over decades for a fair and just society. Maso believes that the fight for social justice is a shared responsibility, and we need to stand in solidarity with the Black people in this process. We have a group of powerful speakers with us today to empower us with their valuable thoughts and insights. Bindu Prasad is going to moderate the conversations. A few words about Bindu Prasad. Bindu Prasad has 20 years of experience in social work practice. Currently, she works as the team lead at Black Creek Community Health Center in Toronto. She obtained her master's degree in social work from the prestigious Loyola College of Social Sciences in 1997. She passed, she attended the bridging program for internationally educated social workers at Ryerson University in 2006. She obtained a certificate in couple and family therapy from the University of Guelph in 2010. Her social work experience largely includes adoption, university student counseling, family services, children's mental health, and community health. She has also tremendous experience in providing individual, couple, family, and group therapy. In her current role, she provides clinical consultations and supports a team of various healthcare providers. Bindu Prasad is a highly energetic volunteer in our community. She is an active member of MASWO, and she has been highly invested in helping our community with her clinical insight with the COVID-19 crisis response programs being organized by MASWO. Bindu Prasad is a passionate advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is a great leader, a role model, and a great source of inspiration for our young generation. Thank you so much, Bindu Prasad, for moderating today's session. Over to Bindu Prasad.
Thank you, Charles. Charles is for all of you. He's the treasurer of MASWO. Thank you so much, Charles, for your kind introduction, and to the executive committee for giving me this opportunity to moderate. A very warm welcome to all of you. Special welcome to our guest speaker, David Grant, our speakers, Raiba Abraham, Anne Mary, Simon Stephen, Anna Siju, and Abby Thomas, and to all our audience. Please note that we will be recording this session and broadcasting live on Facebook. As always, we will begin our session with the land acknowledgement. Aditya Pradeep, our youth member, will deliver the land acknowledgement for us. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Ms. Bindu. Land acknowledgement. In the spirit and intent of Truth and Reconciliations Commission's recommendations, we acknowledge that the traditional indigenous territories on which we gather at the beginning of all MASWO meetings. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Scugog, Hiawatha, Alderville, First Nation. By learning, understanding, and acknowledging, we wish to pay respect to Turtle Island, Mother Earth, and to the rich Indigenous history of Ontario. Over to Ms. Bindu.
Thank you, Aditya. It was well said. It is my honor to be moderating this session on understanding Black lives and creating racial solidarity. Such discourses need to be happening more, so on an ongoing basis and not just limited to February, right? Now, speaking as a brown woman living in North America, I view racism as the worst form of oppression. And I take this moment to acknowledge the oppression shown by brown persons towards Black persons. Through discourses like this, we provide a safe space for each other, learn together to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations that will help us to recognize our explicit and implicit biases, and creating healthy levels of distress in our minds that will push us to make positive choices, thereby minimizing our own biases and working towards racial solidarity so that our Black sisters and brothers are given their due respect. I humbly and thankfully acknowledge that when our Black sisters and brothers have fought for their rights against racism and oppression, we as persons of color have also tremendously benefited as a result of their sacrifices. And we have our responsibility to fight with them. We will start with our guest speaker, David Grant, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. Audience, if you want to use the chat feature, please do so for your questions or sharing your thoughts. So it's my privilege to introduce David Grant. A few words about David. David Grant is a social worker with a specialized interest in mental health, particularly in the mental and emotional health of Black African diaspora boys and men. David was a recipient of the Dean's Honor Writing Award for his Master of Social Work research paper focusing on reconceptualizing the anger, mental and emotional health of previously incarcerated Black African diaspora men in Scarborough. He has since published a journal article on best practices when working with Black fathers in child welfare, mental health, and education systems while exploring being a Black father, while exploring the mental and physical health implications associated with the challenges of being a Black father. David recently published a book entitled Shame Over, a conversation about men's mental health, focusing on helping men of all backgrounds and circumstances heal, acknowledge, and better conceptualize mental illness and distress. David was also a TED Talk speaker where he explored the prison industrial complex, miseducation of our Black boys and men in Canada. David has facilitated the Caring Dads Intervention Group, which focuses on working with male perpetrators of domestic violence, as well as facilitated Afrocentric parenting groups, helping Black African diaspora parents develop healthy coping behaviors to parent while coping with their own trauma. So David has several years of child protection experience and has been active in the discussion and implementation of initiatives targeting anti-Black racism in child welfare. David has been featured on various podcasts and has conducted numerous presentations and lectures to universities, churches, school boards, and child welfare teams on the topics including Black African history, Black African diaspora, mental and emotional health, Black African diaspora family healing interventions, racism, and the child welfare system. So I look forward, all of us look forward to this, David. Over to you.
All right. Thank you, Bindu, for that beautiful introduction. I'm just going to make sure and time myself because I get real passionate about this and I may go overboard. So I'm just clicking the timer now. So again, thank you for having me. Everybody can hear me, right? Yes? Okay, great. So thank you for having me. I think these conversations are so important. They're so imperative because we as African diaspora people, South Asian communities, East Asian, racialized communities are under the same debilitating oppressive system, and that is white supremacy. And so having a talk where it emphasizes the need for solidarity, I think is so important in moving towards the right direction, because what it does is um, minimize the focus or the emphasis on the differences and actually look towards focusing on the similarities between cultures, especially when we think of what was happening in pre-colonial times and how oppression has disrupted those indigenous practices and created the dysfunctionality, unfortunately, within many of our communities that we see today. So today, in honor of Black History Month, I want to speak about I want to shed a bit of light on understanding white supremacy and how it has unfortunately tainted and distorted and created this racial hierarchy where unfortunately African diaspora bodies are seen as being at the bottom of the totem pole and unfortunately sometimes being the scapegoat for other communities is pain and sense of elevation, over Black African diaspora people. I want to speak briefly about that and then talk about how enslavement and oppression is not necessarily a part of Black history. Rather, it has disrupted Black and African history, because too often we think, oh, when we think Black history, we think oppression. And oppression may have occurred, but it does not identify us. And if anything, it has unfortunately helped to dehumanize us and make us forget the beautiful history from where we came. And then, of course, I want to talk about how Black history and African history and the oppression that disrupted that has influenced the current day challenges that we see amongst African diaspora people with many of the various issues that Bindu highlighted in the child welfare system, in the mental health system. And then, of course, I want to just leave some words of wisdom of how we can continue this conversation of solidarity. So white supremacy, this term that we hear too often. Again, I'm not going to go into too much depth because I know, us as professionals, we have some at least superficial awareness of what white supremacy is. But inherently, it's the understanding that white, or it's this delusion, as I say, because it inherently is a delusion that white European paradigms, values, ideologies, and the list extends, are not only the fundamental correct way of doing things, but they are the superior ways. And unfortunately, that notion that was, of course, alongside with colonialism and imperialism and oppression has created a lot of the dysfunction within our various communities, in South Asian communities and African diaspora communities, where it has tainted our psyches to conceptualize our realities based off of how white Europeans have conceptualized our realities. It has taken us away from many of our indigenous practices of how we understand family and how we understand mental health and emotional health and physical health. And unfortunately, it has disrupted and created a sense of disorganization. And we see that we saw that throughout with colonialism. When you look at the general colonial history of racialized people, we see that consistent theme of deeming anything that was non-white European as inferior and therefore in need of control, in need of reformatting, which of course there was absolutely no evidence to show that there was any need for reforming. But unfortunately, the problem with the effects of colonialism is that it has created this sense of lateral violence, not only within our various communities, our respective communities of South Asian, East Asian, and Arab and African diaspora communities, but also amongst each other. And unfortunately, when we look at Canada, and when I look at myself, when I've grown up and understood my various interactions with various other racialized communities, it's been this sense of scapegoating the Black African diaspora community as problematizing us rather than problematizing the system in which we all, unfortunately, are oppressed under. Excuse me. And the problem with that is it doesn't actually move anybody forward. Because as we can see with COVID, white supremacy, or more commonly known as racism, doesn't discriminate. It's non-discriminatory. So just when we think, well, it's the Black people that are the butt of all the racial stereotypes, so we're okay, we're the quote unquote model minorities, as we understand that concept, COVID hits. And then we see the rise of anti-East Asian sentiments. We see the rise of anti-East Asian hate crimes. And then it's almost this sense of shock, right? Our brains just shut down because we're not able to fathom, but I thought we were the model citizens. The Black people are the ones that have the issues. How is it that we are experiencing this? And this is the problem when we seek to divide ourselves as people of color, rather than unite as one to help destroy this oppressive system, we end up in this sense of shock where we're saying, hey, well, help me, help me. And then of course there's this just struggle with understanding, but you were deeming us as the problem rather than the system. And so we need to understand, if there's any theme that I hope all of us get out from my talk, is that white supremacy is non-discriminatory. It does not have special people whom they deem as okay minority. They may give the perception, they may give the illusion that you are quote unquote model minority, but what does that even mean? What does that even mean? It's within the parameters of white supremacy, but once you step out of that, well, now you're problematized. Now you are seen as an issue. And so this is what white supremacy has done. However, there is a unique oppression that unfortunately African people have experienced. And I will get into that now as I talk about African history and how that transitioned into Black history. So when we understand Black history, what is Black history? Or African history. African history, similar to what is pre-colonial, Indian subcontinent history, or East Asian, Chinese, or Vietnamese history. It's understanding that beautiful, natural, and I guess self-empowering, collectively self-empowering history that encompass our indigenous teachings, our indigenous practices, our indigenous values, of understanding that we flourished in the spices and the agriculture that we had within our beautifully naturally rich environments. It's understanding that we had kingdoms, similar to the South Asian communities where they had various kingdoms and dynasties, pre-colonial. African people came from various kingdoms, the Kingdom of Ghana, the Songhay Empire, which was in the Western Sudan region, the Mali Empire. We had universities. Some of the first universities were in Africa, in Morocco, in Sankore University in Timbuktu, Mali. We had some of the first foundations within Egypt that helped to create the modern day clocks. So we have to understand that African history encompasses a time where or various grandeur times, because it wasn't just one time. As a matter of fact, according to scholars, there was 3 grandeur eras that encompass our creativity, our innovation, our way of civilizing the world, not as superior beings, but as simply laying the foundations for what many other cultures, for them to continue to flourish, right? Because as scholars have also noted, African people were the first people to birth the world. The first people were found in Africa. Life is said to have started in Africa. So what we can see the difference when we talk African diaspora people and white European people is we have had this knowledge and have this sense of self-empowerment, not to use to inferiorize other groups, but simply to use as a way of continuing the sense of civilization throughout the world. But what happened with that is what colonialism did is they disrupted that. Not only did they disrupt it, they seek to destroy it and suppress it and wipe it from the memories of African people to delude us to believe that our history started in enslavement. We started out as slaves. And as one scholar, John Henrik Clarke, has said, when your history begins in slavery, everything looks like progress. I'll say that again. When your history is said to have begun in slavery, everything looks like progress. And this is the problem with many of our African diaspora members is, unfortunately, because of that suppression of African history, because of almost that wiping out. I mean, libraries are burnt down, scrolls were burnt. Because of that suppression, unfortunately, we have forgot about our Afrocentric ways. We forgot about our indigenous ways of understanding family and education and mental and emotional health and physical health, natural remedies, because that's been suppressed. And because of the grace of God, where we have some of us who are seeking to revamp that, to seek a psychological renaissance, that is what we're trying to do. But unfortunately, enslavement was one of the major hindrances that has impeded on that development. So when we understand enslavement, again, this could be a whole nother lecture, but briefly, enslavement encompassed a time, one of the most egregious world historical events ever. And what makes it so egregious is African people were one of the only, arguably the only group to be kidnapped from their land and displaced throughout the world to build up white European capitalistic societies. The only group to be kidnapped. And most other groups were oppressed in their land, and being oppressed in their land, it drove some of them to leave, right? For example, the European Jews were, with the Holocaust, they were driven out, right? We even look in the Bible, when we look at the Israelites, they were oppressed in their own land and they were driven out. African people were physically removed from their land. And then the ones that were still there, similar to other racialized communities, had their organizations, their family structures, all topsy-turvy. It was all disorganized, right? The violence that occurred on those who, who opposed such oppression were, of course, made an example. They were tortured, they were killed, and the list extends. With enslavement, it didn't just begin on the plantation. It began on the West African coast. We fought to have the shackles on our necks and our hands. We fought to get on the boat. We fought while on the boat. We fought to get off the plantation. And even after plantation, we fought to rehumanize ourselves. And unfortunately, we don't pay attention always, including many Black African diaspora individuals, to the resistance. The oppression is important, but it's the resistance that we also need to understand, that there were so many instances where slave revolts were happening like frequently. The slave mutinies on the boats were happening frequently because what many African people sought to fight to exclaim was, I would rather die than to live a life in bondage. And what enslavement did was, it was not just a couple whips on the back and picking some sugar cane or cotton or bananas. It was to beat the African out of that individual and dehumanize them and debase them to the point that in people's psyche, they would not even perceive that individual as worthy or even capable of human emotion, human intellectuality, or human capacity to do anything but be dependent on others. And this happened for over 2 centuries. And that doesn't just go away. And so when we look at current day challenges, we have to understand that never went away. As we know, we're social workers. We understand trauma. Trauma doesn't just disappear, poof, Houdini. It doesn't go anywhere. It manifests. And when we look at enslavement, what we have to understand is enslavement encompassed a time where some of the worst sexual, physical, emotional, spiritual, familial, and psychological violence occurred on 3 different periods: on the coast, on the boat, on the plantation, and it continued. And what I always ask people who say, okay, well, why can't African diaspora people just get over it? Why can't they just get over it? Well, I ask, well, tell me when we were able to heal. Tell me when we were able to process emotions. Tell me when we were able to even conceptualize who we were, who we are, and who we shall become. Tell me when that happened. Where was the emotional, psychological interventions post-slavery? And many people end up stumped because they don't think about it like that. They think, well, you're free now, so you should be good. But just like if, for instance, you see when we understand Stockholm syndrome and somebody who's been held captive for 6, 7, 8 years by their kidnapper, and then they say, well, you're free now. What we understand is psychologically they're still enslaved because they've been in captivity for 8 years, and that's just 8 years. So their whole frame of thinking, as we know, trauma reforms the brain, it re-alters the brain. So in understanding that, if we can understand someone who's been kidnapped in captivity for 8 years just by a deranged kidnapper, and how they can't just get over that it takes them many years of therapy that's typically accessible to them to slowly try to work through some of those emotions. Now imagine a whole people. Now imagine a whole race of people where the oppression never stopped, and not only the oppression continued, but we haven't even got over the enslavement for over 2-3 centuries. And so when we look at the current day challenges, not only within the African diaspora community, but the systematic racism that continues against us, we have to understand that the seeds of that hatred, the seeds of that disdain amongst the white oppressors was laid during those colonial times, was laid during those enslavement times. And we know Canada were very active in the participation of the transatlantic slave trade. They were very active for over 2 centuries. For over 2 centuries, the only difference is we didn't have the climate. Canada did not have the climate. It wasn't because they had some sort of better moral capacity than their American counterparts, or than their British counterparts or Portuguese counterparts. It wasn't any sort of distinctive morale that made them feel that slavery was better in Canada. It was simply the climate. But we understand that, again, because that seed of oppression and that seed of white supremacy, that to be white is to be superior and to not be white is to be inferior, that was laid and was maintained into the current day. So when we look at police brutality, police officers are no more than just a reforming of slave overseers and slave masters. When we understand the child welfare system, it's again that same seed of understanding the ways of parenting or the ways of family structures is built on the white European ideology, and therefore inferiorizing every other ideology of racialized communities. But when we understand all of them, the list goes on with mass incarceration, mental health challenges. What I simultaneously want to highlight is that African people have still resisted. They have still sought to thrive. And that is very often overlooked. And even with Black history, we look at historical achievements, which are important, but even modern day achievements, like Jean Augustine, who erected Black History Month within Canada, like, for instance, Viola Desmond, a civil rights activist who had one of the most publicized events in all of Canadian history because she refused to leave an all-white section in a Nova Scotian movie theater. When we think of Elijah McCoy, who helped to create industrial lubrication for mechanical engines of trains, for instance. When we think of Africville in Nova Scotia, where they sought to replicate a village, a community, a self-sustaining community in Nova Scotia, despite malevolent forces preventing it from doing so, we see the resilience that has occurred. When we think of Dudley Laws, who was a firm opposer of police brutality, to the point that he fought so hard, and it created these special investigation units in the police force to investigate civilian and police disputes. That was monumental. We look at the resistance that African people continue to show in pursuing post-secondary institutions, in developing engaging in restaurants, and engaging or creating restaurants and creating job opportunities for the greater community. The fight has continued and has maintained, but unfortunately, the trauma has also continued. The oppression has also continued. So we have this concurrent fight for freedom, but we also have this concurrent oppressive force that tries to impede on that fight. And so it becomes very cumbersome. But what makes it even further cumbersome is when other people who experience similar struggles as us, other racialized communities, try to impede on that by also contributing to discrimination or contributing to the stereotypes, etc., and vice versa. Because African diaspora people are not necessarily that much better of not engaging in the same rhetoric against other racialized communities. So I want to acknowledge that as well. But what I want to highlight is that this doesn't do us any justice. It doesn't move us forward. It doesn't help in dismantling a system that really is non-discriminatory and does not discriminate amongst any of us. And when I've been growing up as a Black man, as a social worker, as a Black man, as a social worker, as a Black man, just as an individual, it unfortunately at times seems like it doesn't matter what I do, I almost can't escape that stereotype. There's times when I was in McMaster University, that was my alma mater for my undergraduate years, and I would be stopped by police just being in a parking lot. I'll never forget, I was with my cousin. I was in a parking lot, and I was stopped by police because they thought we were selling drugs. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I've never sold drugs. I've never smoked drugs in my life, clean. And I was, I think, a second-year student. And he stopped me and asked for my ID with his hand on his gun. And in my mind, I'm trying to conceptualize how in the earth this makes sense when I have not whatsoever even presented as a threat. And when I was searched, and when he found out I was a student, it almost stopped and confused him, because it was almost like he wasn't expecting that, because he saw my school ID, and I gave it to him on purpose. There's been times where I've been mistaken as a previous CAS worker, as a client instead of the social worker. And it confuses me because I'm here dressed to the nine, looking good, and lawyers are asking me, hey, who's your social worker? And I'm confused of the blatant disrespect, because I'm like, not to say that just because clients don't dress the part doesn't mean they can't be mistaken, but again, it confused me. Like, what do I got to do to earn respect, to just be seen as a human being who has done well for himself? And how can I propel past this myth? And it came to my attention that when that foundation, when that implicit bias has already been implanted in our minds, it can unfortunately disrupt any sort of other understanding of who that individual is. It can completely block it out. So when you see a Black man, you're seeing a thug, you're seeing a criminal, even if, yes, you may have got robbed at a store or whatever by somebody that looked like him. There's no room for any sort of growth when you remain with that implicit bias. And this is what solidarity is trying to destroy, is to destroy that implicit bias, and not to ignore the fact that there could be traumatic times where it was a Black individual who may have traumatized you, or may have been a South Asian individual that traumatized a Black person. This is not to exempt those situations. Rather, it's to understand, okay, so that situation may have happened, but what benefit it is to me to use that situation to now have a blanket statement of every single Black person that I see, I'm thinking is like that individual. Or every single South Asian individual I see, or every single East Asian individual that I see is like that other South Asian or East Asian or Arab person that I see. What does that do for us? that creates opposition rather than solidarity. It does not benefit us. So what I urge, what I urge you all today to take away and understand, especially when you're working with Black families in various capacities, what I seek to implant into your minds today is to find similarities with African diaspora families rather than simply focusing on the differences. And even if there are differences, celebrate those differences. So celebrate the differences in food. Celebrate the differences in various spirituality practices. Celebrate the differences in understanding how they perceive education or how you perceive family structures. Celebrate those differences. Don't condemn them. That's what white supremacy has taught us to do, is to condemn differences rather than celebrate them. When I've worked in CAS and I've worked with various South Asian families, those from India, those from Bangladesh, those from Pakistan, and when I've worked with them, the ones who have gotten along with the best are the ones where we can laugh and talk about the various ways we do things. So they'll say, oh, well, we cook rice this way. I'm like, oh, well, we cook rice this way. Oh, it's like, okay, well, our family, for certain family get-togethers, we do this. I'm like, oh, well, family get-togethers, we do this. When it comes to, of course, some of the challenges, especially when we're talking the child welfare system, it's saying, okay, well, I did this because in our culture, we do this. I'm like, I get that that's similar to how we do it in our culture. Okay, how can we work to reestablish a connection with you and your children? How can we look to rectify this challenge? That has worked wonders because we celebrate the differences, we celebrate the similarities, but then we can work together in a unified fashion to try to find a way to work together cohesively. And that, unfortunately, I think is what has been missing. But I think, this your guys' organization can actually help in creating, is taking that understanding of solidarity and actually applying it to the real world practices, is saying, okay, we may differ from African diaspora communities in some ways, but we are very similar in other ways. Why don't we actually seek to highlight that? That is how we create, similarity, or that's how we create solidarity. And also how we create solidarity is that concurrent advocacy, that relentless advocacy for African diaspora families. And what does that mean? It means highlighting the anti-Black racism that takes place in many of our various communities, including many various African diaspora communities, because unfortunately, as we know, colorism, as a result of white supremacy, has permeated all racialized communities. This notion of lighter skin being in closer proximity to whiteness, therefore equating to higher power and more deserving of respect. This delusion, because none of it is true. But unfortunately, that has permeated various African diaspora communities, South Asian, East Asian, and Arab communities, and has unfortunately plagued many of even the existing systems. For example, the caste system, which was already pre-established, pre-colonial, was therefore tainted by this notion of colorism. And so when we start to understand this universal oppressive structure that has affected us in various similar ways, we can actually seek to rectify working together, because we can say, okay, wait, the same force is actually affecting us similarly with various nuances, but similarities affecting us. How can we actually advocate alongside you? So it becomes this reciprocal relationship where when South Asians are the butt of anti-South Asian rhetoric and hate sentiments, the Black people are right up alongside. And when it's vice versa, when it's the anti-Black racist sentiments and the hate crimes, the South Asian community is right there. So as we know, strength in numbers. When we start to see that correlation, that unification amongst all racialized people, because contrary to popular belief in the world, people of color actually are the majority, despite this notion of us being quote unquote minority people, right? We are the majority. When we actually seek to do that, we will start to see change. We will start to see that we have no benefit of profiting off of other groups' pain, profiting off of other groups' oppressive state. If anything, we actually can do more when we align with other racialized communities. And this is not something just for the South Asian community to understand. It's something also for the Black African diaspora community to understand, that we are not to just fight in isolation, to just simply fight for Black people at the expense of other people. Now, of course, we know our community best, so it's doing that concurrent fight within the community. but not saying, well, I'm gonna let the other communities do their own thing and I'm just gonna focus on my community. That will not benefit us. It's that reciprocal relationship of when one falls, we all fall. When one celebrates, we all celebrate. If we can actually seek in our work to start to exemplify that, we will see change. We will start to see change. We saw that when George Floyd was murdered. We saw that when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. And we saw this global unity amongst those who do not identify as African diaspora people. And it was so beautiful to see. My push is for that to be maintained and to not just simply be something that is sparked out of emotion, but it becomes something psychological, something that we've internalized, and it becomes natural for us to even want to do that. And I can definitely say with myself growing up in Scarborough, I saw the potential of that because of the, I guess, the quote unquote forced integration of various cultures of various ethnicities. So growing up, it was common to have a Sri Lankan friend, to have a Chinese friend, and have a Jamaican friend, and to have an Arab friend, a Libyan friend, whomever. And because of that, we actually were able to unify that much better. Now, that is just a small example, but just imagine if that was happening on a larger scale. And so I leave that with you. And I again want to highlight that this racial hierarchy does not exist. And this notion of wanting to perpetuate anti-Black racism does not benefit anybody. White supremacy is non-discriminatory, and we need to seek solidarity and celebrating the resistance of our African diaspora brothers and sisters, and seek to unify with them in the fight against trying to end oppression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. David,
Very
you know what? You remind me of a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter.
Yes.
Racism and oppression does matter.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your insights and experiences. Helping us to continue our conversation, right, on solidarity and how we can work together and celebrate our differences.
Yes.
Thank you also for taking us through the African history, how the African, suppression of the African history, and how trauma, very briefly, but how trauma is manifested in the lives of Black sisters and brothers, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So now I understand you have to leave, but I hope you we have about 15 minutes for a Q&A session.
I have some time yet to answer any questions or comments, so no problem.
Yes, thank you so much. To the audience here, feel free to we are open to questions and answers, and David is also here with us. We have some comments here, David, on the chat. Thank you so much. This was powerful, very powerful. Thanks. Awesome. Thanks for your insights.
I see a hand raise.
Right.
Yeah.
Karan?
Yeah. Hi, David. That was awesome to listen to you. I think your speech helps raise a mirror to the South Asian community, because like you alluded to it, we also have casteism, which also tends to dehumanize human beings. And the only way to come out of that is to develop a sense of empathy. So one thing that I have always thought about is when I heard about it in the context of Black Lives Matter, can you tell me a little bit about the discussions that Black families have to have with their children in terms of the uh, racism that they might face in their future, and how to prepare for that, and how painful that conversation is?
Okay, you want me to shed insight on what that is?
Be able to shed some insight on that?
Yes,
please?
no problem. So the conversation that unfortunately many Black families have to have as a result of the system in which we're living under is explaining, sometimes as young as 6, 7 years old, that whether it's to a Black boy or whether it's to a Black girl, that they are not going to be perceived in a manner that humanizes them. And what I mean by that is, we as Black parents, I have a young son, he's almost 3. And, I remember, and I'll give you an example, we were running around and we're playing outside, and he was pretending to open a car door. And see, some would say, oh, he's just a little kid, he's innocent, let him play around, and or just reprimand him for not doing that. But what I have to explain to him, and this was when he was 2, is, Jeremiah, you can't do that, because in the next couple of years, if somebody catches you do that, you may get shot. And what some would say is, David, that's an exaggeration. Tamir Rice, a young Black boy in the United States, was shot at the age of what, 11, 12 years old? A little Black girl in Brampton was having a meltdown. She's 6 and was handcuffed to the floor. And there was absolutely no way that police were able to not justify that. They were seeking to justify it. But in my head, I'm like, there's no way to justify handcuffing a 6-year-old, no more than what, 65, 70-pound little girl. And so these are the conversations we as Black parents have to have with our children, to not scare them or to demoralize them and create a sense of a negative self-concept within them. But it's to prepare them for how they're going to be viewed in society, but to teach them how to overcome that. And how we teach them to overcome that is by continuously, rigorously creating a sense of self-empowerment, self-knowledge, and self-acceptance, so that when they come into contact with this, it's not a surprise. That they're able to say, you know what, this is not going to define who I am. When I'm pulled over by police, it's teaching them, you know what, under this system, do not resist, because you want to see tomorrow. They understand, okay, this is what I have to do to survive, and this is what I need to do to live the next day, to continue to fight the fight. When we teach our children that, it's creating a sense of self-empowerment, but of course, it's trying to combat that oppressive force that continues to try to hinder that. And these are the conversations we as Black parents, as Black family members, have to have with our greater community. And that's just a little bit, but I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Great.
David, we have one more question from the chat from Donna Matthews.
Okay.
Donna has I'll just read it out. I think you've raised so many great points, especially around the way we need to check our implicit bias when working with Black communities. So what are some actionable ways we as social workers can improve our practice with Black youth and families?
Okay, so some actionable items. So one thing I can say is when we're writing reports, for instance, and I would do this when I was working at CAS, is to highlight how oppression impedes on the overall development of Black families. It's not to take away personal accountability, because that's often the rebuttal. Oh, so are we saying people don't take responsibility for their actions? That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we need to understand that many of these families, in their natural environment, which is an environment that fosters cultural growth, they don't actually experience, and studies show this, they don't actually experience the same sort of dysfunctionality that we see in the Canadian settings, because of existing in an unnatural, often alien environment to their natural cultural practices. So what I would say is when we're writing reports and we're trying to understand why certain Black youth, for instance, are resistant, why certain Black families are resistant to change or resistant to working with individuals, just an example in understanding resistance, it's understanding how has oppression influenced this. So when we're writing our reports, it's showing a blips of what oppression, of how oppression is possibly impacting the families, by looking for tangible, not just theorizing, but actually looking for tangible ways this is happening. For instance, if you're having a family who's living in a tough area in Rexdale, for instance, or living in a tough area in Galloway, to understand how that environmental challenges is impacting these families to actually thrive, and what are some various ways it's impacting, and how the family has actually been demonstrating strengths to persevere. So those are some actionable ways, is really being important. It's the importance of highlighting the strengths amidst an environment that seeks to oppress them. So if that, I guess, would say is one powerful way, because reports are so important. The number of reports that I've read that typically define what a family is or how a youth interacts really sets the tone for how that next worker is going to interact with them. So really being clear in reports of the strengths of families and how they've actually been resistant. There's many more, but That's just one that I hope is tangible enough that reports are important. Hope that answers that individual's question.
Okay, the next question here is from Simon Stephen. What are your thoughts about the campaign defunding the police? Are you aware of a credible coalition in Ontario or Canada in general that is leading the campaign for defunding the police, which we could join in as well individually and collectively?
So, so the notion defund the police, I know just the term in general, of course, has raised some questions. Really, defund the police is reallocating resources, the plethora of resources that is given to police officers, and actually relocating them to the community, which for me just makes sense for everybody, right? Especially when we're talking mental health crises. So I have no issue with the movement, of defunding the police, because I think, especially when we're talking mental health crises, a lot of the, social workers, us in general, we are trained to de-escalate situations. The number of heightened situations that I walked into that have been able to de-escalate, that in often other circumstances with police officers, that's resulted in murder. I'm not saying every police officer, but often enough. I agree with the fact that we need to defund and reallocate, not to take away the resources that are given to police officers, because we have some extreme situations where we need the police, but to reallocate and to have more joint partnership with social workers and nurses and police officers when, for instance, doing home visits, when working with mentally distressed clients. So I agree with that. And I hope that answers that question. In terms of coalitions, I do know the Black Lives Matter organization, that is their utmost priority. I don't have, I guess you could say, in-depth knowledge of where that coalition is based and what that looks like. But I would say, a quick Google search of the Black Lives Matter organization, and then there'll be different organizations attached to that. I know the Black, is it the African, well, it used to be the African Canadian Legal Clinic, but I think it's now the Black Legal Action Center or something like that. I know they also do a lot of work when it comes to police brutality. So those are some different organizations to reach out to, and they'd be able to possibly redirect you to engaging in the struggle.
Thank you, David. We have a few more questions here. I'll be fast. This question is from Alan. You being a social worker, Dad, what is your advice to kids and parents if they experience racism in school or workplace?
Well, my advice, so I guess from a parent perspective, never let it slide. Never, ever let it slide, because that will set the precedence for how your child will be treated in that school. Even if it's not, doesn't actually prove to be racist, and maybe it was simply just a misunderstanding, you make sure you let it be known that your child will not be the butt of any sort of racist jokes. So if it's a comment about a child wearing a turban, or if it's a comment about a child's food or something like that, you never let that slide of kids just being kids. Never. And that's me speaking as a parent. I think that's so imperative when you set the tone, you set the precedent, so that, because schools know and they take note. Okay, no, this parent, we don't want to mess with that child because that parent plays no games, right? And typically those children don't end up being the victims as often as other kids whose parents, unfortunately, are a bit more apathetic. So I would say with that, and as a social worker, when it comes to racism, same thing. We take no, we should not let any of that slide. When it comes to meetings, if there's something that just doesn't sit right with you, this does not sit right with your spirit, you need to call it out. If it means taking a pause from a meeting, just saying, hey, I just want to come back to that comment that you made. I've done that in meetings. I just want to come back to that comment you made, or just want to come back to that statement you said about that child. How is that relevant? That seems a bit prejudice. Can we talk more about that? Oh no, that's not what. Well, no, I want to talk more about that. So they know, okay, this is not something that we need to ever do, because it's not only about educating them about how wrong it is, but it's just saying this never can happen again. It's creating expectations, I think, when it comes to racism, because when we do that, then we are preparing our children of how to deal with racism. Because too often, if we just kind of shrug it off, then our children are going to learn to just shrug it off. But unfortunately, we know that's not going to actually happen. They're actually going to internalize, and it's going to damage their self-esteem. So that's how I would say, both as a parent and as a social worker, create the expectation that racism would never be tolerated, and anything that even hints the sense of racism, you call it out. Some would say you're being oversensitive. That's okay. I would rather take that than being too lenient with certain situations until it blows up into something more serious.
Thank you, David. One last question here from Sharon Grant. Can you speak to the impact of trauma? Does it impact Black families differently from other racialized groups? How can I best support a family coming from best support families coming from those different lens?
Okay, so speak about racial trauma and how it affects Black families and if it affects them differently. And what was the last piece again? What was the last?
So how can I best support families coming from a different lens?
Coming from a different lens. Okay. So racial trauma, in short, definitely affects Black African diaspora families, even if it's coming from those that aren't white, so those other racialized communities. Now, is it as hard hitting as if it's coming from somebody who's white European? I think that's subjective. For myself, maybe not necessarily, but I think it still hurts. And I think it hurts in a different way because it hurts from it hurts from a place of hoping that they would actually be more of an ally rather than engaging in the oppression. So I think it hurts in a different way versus if it's from, somebody who is white European, for instance, it's coming from a sense of, okay, so you're doing this and just maintaining that sense of power. So racial trauma, how that affects them is it creates this sort of hypervigilance. It creates this almost this real sense of paranoia because you never know if something is happening because you're Black, if something's happening because you have dark skin or you have if you have kinky hair. So you almost develop a sense of paranoia that can be misdiagnosed as being something that's just something part of delusions because, well, I don't know. I think the police were following me. I think this person may be paranoid. Or it can sense this heightened sense of anxiety because you don't know if you're going to go into this courtroom and someone's going to call you the N-word. You don't know if you're going to go into this store and someone's going to say, no, I want to kick you out because no Black people allowed, especially if it's coming from somebody who's not white, right? So you develop a sense of hypervigilance. So of course, racial trauma definitely drastically affects the psyche. And as we know, stress kills. Chronic stress leads to a consistent release of cortisol that has various negative physical health implications. And so it's not just, oh, racial trauma just disappears. No, it actually, if it's intense enough, it can lead to hypertension. It can lead to cardiovascular challenges. It can lead to all of those physical health implications. So we have to understand racial trauma definitely affects it. And in terms of how to view Black families from a different lens, empathy. Put yourself in those shoes, especially when we're talking racialized communities. How have you felt when people have made fun of you for various cultural nuances that have been normal to you but hadn't deemed abnormal by other people? Empathy is so critical and it's something that's so overlooked. When you empathize with an individual, and that's what I've done, when I've been working with those who are not Black but are racialized, I empathize with them and I say, okay, especially when I was younger, okay, why am I going to go and be mean to this individual when I hate when people make certain comments about me and my skin or my hair or my nose or whichever? Empathy goes a long way. And how you do that is you just stop and reflect. Self-reflection is so key. When you stop and reflect on how have I felt when certain situations like this have happened? Okay, now how can I make sure and I don't replicate that for another individual? That goes such a long way.
Thank you, David. We have Joji who's raised his hand and one more question from the chat.
Okay.
All right. Hi, David. It was a pleasure to listen to you and a very powerful message. My simple question is not a simple question. My question to you is, what do you think are the challenges the Black youth face in our community now? And what do you foresee as the changes should happen, both from political, educational? I work in the child welfare sector. I know it's a broad topic, but still, what do you think should be the changes? We hear a lot of history. This is our history. Moving forward, what do you think should change and what we can learn from it?
Okay, so with Black youth, I think there's a lot there's a lot of things Black youth experience, but I think one of the most fundamental issues that Black youth experience is this sense of as I call it, psychological homelessness. This feeling of not the sense of not feeling like you belong anywhere. So you don't feel like you belong, and especially with the youth who are disconnected from their culture, their community of origin, when they don't feel like they're connected to their Jamaican community or their Ghanaian community. They don't feel like they're connected to the Canadian community because they're, as I call it, Canadian without privilege. And of course, when they're not connected with their indigenous understandings of who they are as African people, it creates a sense of psychological homelessness where they just are wandering and don't know who they are. And what that ends up manifesting into is depression. And how they cope with depression is with some boys, they cope with it through masking it with anger. So a lot of the violence that's happening on our streets is a lot of these Black male youth who really are engaging in this violence because they feel so dejected to direct their anger to the oppressive systems that continue to oppress them. And so what they do is they displace that onto those that look like them. Because unfortunately, what colonialism has done is damage their sense of self-esteem. And anybody, if they hate themselves, then they're going to hate people that look like them. So they direct their anger towards those that look like them. And really, especially when we understand boys and men of all cultures, anger and violence is typically used to mask our own mental health challenges, right? Which, because of being socialized to not be expressive of our vulnerabilities, contrary to women. So with a lot of our Black youth, for instance, who are experiencing violence in the streets, that's depression, that's anxiety, right? We need to treat them not as they're criminals, but treat them as mentally distressed youth. And when I was working at CAMH, that's what I was doing. With a lot of them who are involved in gang shootouts, I would say, okay, well, tell me when you're alone, what are your thoughts? And you will start to see the depression is actually there. But of course, because of that hegemonic masculinity, in other words, white European masculinity, they're trying to emulate, well, I have to suppress that. So I have to engage in this violence to prove that I'm still a man. And that's on the one extreme. The other extreme is drowning yourself in substance use. So they're saying, I hate myself so much, I'm drowning myself in drugs. I'm drowning myself in promiscuity. I'm drowning myself in various self-destructive behaviors to really mask the fact that I really am wrestling with who I am as a result of these various messages of who I'm supposed to be. So those are some of the challenges that Black youth are experiencing, both male and female, because we're starting to see it almost equally for both. And then in terms of the political and educational reformation for the future, what I definitely feel needs to happen is there needs to be, although there's a push for Black, for Black therapists and Black therapy in a sense like that, I think as part of reparations for the continued oppression, I think there needs to be more push for subsidizing for therapy and psychotherapeutic interventions for the masses, because as we know, we can't focus on the small percentage of middle-class Blacks who maybe have access to therapy or who maybe have access to educational opportunities. We need to look at the masses, and unfortunately, the masses show that they don't have access to that healing. So we have a whole bunch of young Black people who are running around mentally distressed because oppression is debilitating their whole mental capacity. So I think the government, we need to push the government for more subsidized therapeutic interventions. We need to seek to push for even education. The education needs to be relevant. We can't just push for going to post-secondary. We need to push for helping grassroots organizations who are trying to use education as a tool of empowerment rather than a tool of servitude, of just getting a job and serving a white organization. We need to help serve those or fund those grassroots organizations who are actually looking to empower Black youth to use education as a way of empowering the community. Because when you do that, you will start to see an increase or an amelioration of a positive self-concept, because you actually see yourself as having purpose. You feel more connected to community. We are very, as human beings, we thrive when we are connected to when we're connected to our community. We thrive when we actually feel a sense of belonging. So in understanding, the research shows that that's what I feel we need to be doing. Education, and starting with the community level, as well as seeking out subsidized psychotherapeutic intervention for our Black youth.
Thanks, David.
Very welcome.
Thank you, David. We have one last question, and I'm just reminding of the time. It's 4 minutes past 3. Are you okay with taking this last question?
Yes. My wife, she's good with taking care of my son. So I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So this this question is from Arsha. Has it ever been a case from your personal experience where clients need to be educated about racism, and how do we deal with such situations?
Yes, there have been there's been many situations, and I think there's people have various sentiments about racialized people always having to educate those for example who are white and lack their and have a lack of education. But even amongst us as racialized people, we'll say some very ignorant things towards one another, right? There's been things I have misunderstood when I've worked with various Pakistani clients, for instance, and there's been various things that they've misunderstood when it comes to working with Black people, for instance, right? So yes, there's been plenty of situation. I'm trying to think of one specifically where I had to educate someone. So for instance, when people see me, and I've had this with both East Asian and South Asian community as well as Arabs as well, and they've said, "Oh, so you're African," and I'm just like, well, yes, technically, right? But I have to explain to them the essence of the slave trade. And I say, well, yes, I'm African, but I'm also technically Jamaican. And, it's a quick little brief, like, came from Africa to Jamaica, working on plantation. My parents emigrated here because unfortunately the dysfunctionality and the economic devastation as a result of the plantation created an economic devastation for the community. Parents are here. End of story, right? So this is a quick little brief where it doesn't seem like it's tumultuous, because for me that helps to build rapport. I think if you try to shrug that off, or if you get aggravated and say, oh, you do your own research on what that even means, that doesn't build rapport. For me, I'm all about building relationships. So there's certain instances where I've been like, you know what, maybe that's your homework. Look up A, B, and C when it comes to working with, when it comes to understanding the identity of Black people. And other times I'm like, no, I'm yes, technically Jamaican, but I'm African, I'm technically Jamaican. I explain to them, and they say, oh, okay. Because of course there's that generalization, well, all Black people are African. I'm like, well, yes, technically, but you have to understand the cultural nuances. So that's been that. When it comes to racism, for instance, yes, I've had, especially when you're talking white European racism, I've had instances even up here in the Yukon where I've, where people will say like, oh, well, you colored people. And I have to explain to them like, wrong again. Like we don't use that anymore, right? You say I'm a Black person, you can refer to me as a Jamaican person, as a, an Afro-Jamaican person, but colored has a negative undertone to it. And they said, and some of them, and most people have been like, oh, I'm so sorry, I guess that's outdated, very outdated. Others will try to combat, and I'll say, well, and I'll sometimes refer to them back as a term that they don't like. So for example, with white people, I've said, well, do you like the term cracker? And they're like, well, no. And I'm like, well, exactly, right? It's derogatory, it's not nice. So let's just call each other by terms that are respectful. People are like, what, fair enough, right? I think when you come at it from that lens, where you're not trying to be combative, but you're just trying to make your point, again, comes back to the point of expectations. When you create the expectation of respectability, you say, well, no, just like you don't like how this is called, I don't like how this is called. I would say it's the same thing even with names. Push people to pronounce your full names. I've had various friends who are Nigerian have their full Nigerian name. And they'll say, oh, but you can just call me this. Like, no, they can pronounce Tchaikovsky and Jovicic, right? They can pronounce, Aduande, right? They can pronounce your full name. You push that, you create the expectation. And if that's too inconvenient for that individual as part of racism, well, you know what? They need to check themselves. We need to create a sense of accountability and expectations so that people know that we're putting an end to racism, that you're going to make effort to humanize us, because when we let little microaggressions like that slide, it turns into a bigger monster. So I hope that answers that individual's question.
Thank you, David, for your insights.
Yes, no problem. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you all again.
Yeah. Would you like to stay for a few more minutes just to hear our the youth volunteers speak?
I can. My wife had let me know that she's got my son under control, because that was really why I was like, oh, I'm not sure, but she's let me know that I can I could spare, yeah, another 10 or 15 minutes or so. So
Sure.
we can do that.
Thank you so much. So I move on to so now this this is a very special session for us, not only because of your presence, David, and talking about this ongoing dialogue on racial solidarity, but also because 3 of our 5 speakers are youth. And they're our next generation. So I have immense pride in our next generation, and this is me personally here, right? To my colleague, to my Malayali community, like I want to share this, like this, what you're going to hear from them or how they're going to present is very different from how our movies typically portray them. These are young minds loaded with empathy, compassion, anti-oppression, and liberal values. You will hear from them soon, and you'll also feel the same pride. They are definitely role models to not only to their next generation, but they're also our educators and change drivers for us as their parents. So I proudly present our first speaker, Raiba Abraham. Raiba is a grade 9 student who is the youngest in a family of 4. She has an older brother who is 19. She goes to a sports high school called David Suzuki. She's an active volunteer of MASWO's youth leadership. Raiba's hobbies include playing many sports, but mainly American football, playing violin, rock climbing, and many more. She also loves to be around people and is always ready to help someone who is in need. She loves to meet new people, which inspires her to become better and stronger in life. She's filled with joy, energy, and happiness, and she loves to spread the positivity and the happy vibes to others. She's outgoing and understandable. Raiba, welcome, and over to you.
Hello. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Ms. Bindu. First of all, I just want to say that was a wonderful and powerful session. Thank you, Mr. David. And I also like to thank the MASWO community for this opportunity. And now I'll share my thoughts. So I personally think that the history behind the Black community is far greater than what is portrayed by the media and the government. It's almost ironic how the history of our Black brothers and sisters are being condensed into the shortest month of the year due to systematic racism. Systemic racism is also known through various ways in our modern society, like in employment, housing discrimination, and incarcerations. The violence endured by the Black community is unheard and is silenced from the public. But it is our duty to stand against systemic racism. We could do this by standing side by side with our Black community and by movements such as Black Lives Matter. We should always also promote and spread awareness through our schools and government systems. As a youth, I could stand in unity and spread awareness through social media platforms and in classrooms environments. Now, I would like urge us people to stand in solidarity against the systemic racism in our society. The brown community's attitude towards the Black community is sometimes misguided due to their lack of knowledge. Most Indians don't know that Africans play a crucial role in India during the 14th and 17th century, that they really flourished as artists, rulers, architects, and reformers between the 14th century and the 17th century. In the past, most people from the Asian culture have looked down on and have stereotypes towards the Black community. They believed that the media was showing and portraying this to society. They only acknowledged what they have heard, but over the course of time, I personally think that the Asian culture is more educated and is understanding the awareness of our Black sisters and brothers. I personally believe that that the Asian community will become stronger and wiser on how they view the Black community. And together we can build a strong and very treasurable bond. Thank you. I will head it over to Ms. Bindu.
Thank you, Raiba. It was such a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you for highlighting the systemic racism and our responsibility to stand with our Black brothers and sisters. And also thanks for the talking about the historical relationship between the African community and the South Asian community. Next, I'm going to present to you Anne Mary. I'm very happy to share a few words about Anne Mary. Anne Mary Charles is a grade 9 student. She attends Holy Name of Mary Catholic Secondary School in Brampton. She enjoys reading, writing, singing, and listening to music. Anne Mary is a member of the Youth Leadership Program with MASWO She enjoys the community engagement and is passionate about making positive changes in her community. Anne-Marie, over to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Prasad. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anne-Mary Charles, and I'm a grade 9 student. First of all, I would like to thank MASWO for giving me this opportunity to present my views on this well-known platform. I'm humbled and honored to represent myself as a racialized young woman. I personally believe that understanding and honoring the contribution of Black people should not be limited to a month, but should be an ongoing affair, and to be an inseparable part of who we are as a progressive society. For me, understanding Black history is about understanding the contributions and achievements of our Black brothers and sisters. It is also about understanding our history, the real history of Canada. However, I believe the history that we learn in our curriculum is incomplete and biased. Unfortunately, I do not see a lot of Black and other racialized heroes and their contribution in the history that is being taught in our schools. I have learned that slavery and other forms of inhuman practices existed here in Canada. I have also learned that European settlers shattered the lives of the original owners of this land. However, a great deal of their stories are missed and unrecognized. In my perspective, history is being taught in a selective manner in our school system, or in a way that meets the interest of the dominant group. As a result, we often understand history in a partial and inequitable way. In effect, we get systemically isolated from the real pain and agony of the Black, Indigenous, and other racialized groups, as well as their contributions in our society. Historically, marginalized sections have been made invisible, and their stories are stereotyped and labeled in our discourses. I strongly believe we all have the right to be equally represented in our history. We all need our due share in our history. Otherwise, it is not our history. We need to work in solidarity with each other to make it happen. If we do not speak up today, we will be left with very little tomorrow. And when we do this, we are rewriting our history. How can we have informed opinions if we don't know the history the right way? Our responses to the problems we encounter in our social life as racialized people are rooted in the right understanding about our own surroundings, including the history. For me, understanding our real history is a part of my identity, belonging, and growth. Right understanding enables us to recognize, respect, and honor by destroying stereotypes, myths, and false beliefs, not only about Black people, but all racialized people. This is essential for a brighter future for all of us. Therefore, in my opinion, it is important for children to have the opportunities and resources to study the real history of Canada. It can vitally shape our perspectives and self-esteem. As I grow up, I will stay committed to be critical and not judgmental, widening my openness and work collaboratively with my peers to end racial and other forms of discrimination, especially against Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities. Thank you.
So it was such a pleasure to listening to you, Anne-Mary. I love that you talked about understanding the contributions of our Black sisters and brothers, and also, highlighting that there are deficiencies in our history textbooks, right, and classes, and you're here, you are advocating that our ancestor stories, right, be part of our history, right, which is actually the real history, not what we're learning right now. Thank you so much, Anne-Mary. Okay, so now we are moving on to our next speaker for the day, and he is Simon Stephen. A few words about Simon. Simon has completed MSW and LLB at Indore University. In India, he has worked for 12 years in the realm of rural community development. Subsequently, for nearly 4 years, he worked with the GAP and to enforce labor standards for their vendors in India, Bangladesh, and Canada. The bulk of his Canadian experience has been in child welfare for 18 years. Simon, over to you.
Please unmute, Simon.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you once again, Bindu, and our special guest, David Grant, MASWO's young friends, Reba, Anne Mary, and Anna, and my fellow Malayali social workers in Ontario. I'm truly glad that our organization, MASWO, took the initiative to organize this webinar to observe the Black History Month. I'd like to share my thoughts on our strengths as well potential challenges that we'll likely face as Malayali and brown social workers when dealing with the issue of anti-Black racism in Canada. Talking about racism openly and directly with our Black clients and co-workers is never easy. What I found most helpful is to draw parallels to the anti-Black racism in North America with the practice of casteism back home. The connection between Dalits and the Black community in North America goes back to nearly 140 years, when Dalits looked up to their African American compatriots for inspiration as they struggled for their freedom from slavery. In the post-independence era of the 1970s, the Dalit Panthers came into force in tandem with the Black Panther movement in the United States. And then come 2020, the widespread protest by the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, gave rise to a full-blown Dalit Lives Matter movement in India. If the death of George Floyd triggered the outrage in North America, it was a rape, murder, and forced cremation of a 20-year-old Dalit woman in Uttar Pradesh that galvanized the youth and even some media outlets in India were usually hesitant at criticizing the present government. As members of MASWO, most of us had our formative years in India and therefore had been exposed to the raging controversy relating to the reservation policy. For the sake of our guests who are not familiar with India's reservation policy, it is a caste-based reservation system to redress the historical caste discriminations. The reservation policy in India has been very divisive, thanks to its distortion by all the political parties. Therefore, this has impacted every Indian, directly or indirectly. Whether the reservation policy has helped the cause of Dalits is a matter for another conversation. However, it is important for us to reflect as to how this ongoing divisive controversy back home has affected our individual perception and attitude in relation to the ongoing oppression based on caste or race. Just as white supremacy would use any means to legitimize anti-Black racism, so would Brahmanism seek to negate the spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity in India. Apart from casteism, we also struggle with our inherent bias and prejudice against Blackness and preference for lighter complexions. Once we all landed in Canada, we got connected with a caste base or regional associations, which often results in strongly discouraging our children from dating or marrying Black Canadians. The BLM protests last year had sparked some vigorous conversations online as well offline among the second generation Malayali youth about how to respond and how to address apathy, anti-Black racism, and casteism within. Last year, they created a Facebook group called Malayalis for Black Lives. This Facebook group currently has a membership of nearly 9,500 members, young and old, including yours truly. Also, as immigrants and brown skin, we struggle with insecurities and the need to fit in. This often tends to result in most of us falling for the trap of becoming the model minority, which is essentially meant to be that we are hardworking, better educated, and law-abiding, unlike our Black brethren. We argue that we have also experienced racism in this country and that it was because of our sheer hard work that we could pull ourselves up out of racism by our bootstraps and have become successful. This apparently is a very clever myth promoted by the white supremacists to squash Black power and racial justice movements. We must, however, recognize that the experiences of Black people in North America have been far more challenging. Many South Asians came into this country through point systems and were selected because of privileged backgrounds. Black people came to this continent as property. There is a definite trauma that Black people have experienced with an erasure of their culture and identity, which we cannot begin to understand. We must therefore look to learn and platform the experiences of Black individuals as they continue to show the power of resistance. We should remind our Malayali and South Asian diaspora in North America that we are the biggest beneficiaries of the Black people's struggles and sacrifices. The fact is that the Black Power movement of 1960s had led to the addition of Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Canadian Constitution, which all of us Black, brown, and the white equally enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. I like that you parallel the Black racism with the systemic oppression practice in India, right, against the Dalits. It gives all of us some thoughts to reflect on. Thank you also so much for mentioning about the Malayalis for Black Lives organization. I think some of us will be interested, and also mentioning about the myth of model minority. Thank you so much for that. Just a reminder to everybody that you can use the chat feature to type your messages, your comments, or your questions. We have 2 more speakers to go. So I am going to proudly talk about our next speaker. She's Anna Siju. Anna is a 4th-year undergraduate student at Queen's University in the concurrent education program in math and religion. As an aspiring teacher, she's passionate about teaching and education. She's currently the president of Queen's South Asian Association. Queen's South Asian Association is the largest cultural hub at Queen's University. It promotes cultural diversity at Queen's. It also host various events throughout the year to share and celebrate the beauty of South Asian culture. On the note, Anna is a swimmer and she is with a lifeguard license. Anna, welcome and over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to MASWO for inviting me to share my perspective on anti-Black racism in our community today. It's an honor to be here. So I just wanted to start by talking about the tragic death of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. This led to a new rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, with protests happening all over the world. This movement brought to light many of the injustices taking place even today. So while Black Lives Matter protests were taking place around the world, racialized students at Queen's University took to social media to bring to light the racism happening within our school. Queen's University has had a history of racist incidents happening over the years, including parties mocking people's racial identities, written threats to racialized and LGBTQ+ students posted in residence buildings, vandalism of property in the Four Directions Indigenous Student Center, and many other examples. One of the most shocking things to occur at Queen's is the century-long ban for Black students to get admission into the Queen's Medical School that wasn't officially removed until April 2019. In the summer of 2020, students began sharing their experiences through social media with pages such as Stolen by Smith. Through these platforms, students made anonymous confessions about their experiences. Many of the confessions on these pages are truly shocking. Since then, Queen's University has been making an effort to be more inclusive and have clubs dedicated to educate students and provide safe spaces. However, we are far from perfect and must continue to improve. These events over the past year have made me reflect on my own privilege as a South Asian woman. Although we face ignorance and racism, it cannot be compared to the unique experiences of the Black community. This is because we are part of the model minority myth. This myth paints the idea that certain racialized communities are more intelligent, more capable, and more hardworking than while others are not. This ideology not only pits us against each other, it leads to stereotyping and, most importantly, ignores the deeply ingrained systems of oppression the Black community faces. We are not on a level playing ground, and that is very important to understand. Anti-Blackness is deeply rooted in South Asian culture, most notably with our standards in beauty. From a young age, we are taught that white is a standard we should strive to be. The majority of actresses are light-skinned. Lighter-skinned individuals are preferred for marriage proposals. There even is a huge industry for whitening products profiting from this colorism. The idea that anti-Blackness is deeply rooted in our culture further perpetrates anti-Black racism. So the question is, what can we do as South Asian youth to be allies in this movement? I believe the first step is to acknowledge our personal privilege and accept that we as a community have not experienced the same depth of racial injustice and inequality. The next thing to do is to continue having conversations and discussions like this. We should have the courage to challenge the older mentality, speak up, hold people accountable, educate, and continue to educate ourselves. The real change starts at home with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thanks for sharing your, your experiences with your university and also the advocacy movement, right, towards inclusivity. I'm glad to hear that, like 2019 April, there was some positive changes for our Black community. Yeah. Also, yeah, I also love that I highlighted the South Asian bias, especially around shadism. Just for the information, shadism is part of, it's all over the world, right? Across cultures, you'll find shadism and the preference for lighter shade. Yeah. Thank you so much. So our final speaker for today is Abby Thomas. Abby Thomas is a registered social worker. He completed his MSW from Indore School of Social Work in 2005. He also did his IESW, the International Educated Social Work Program, in 2014. Since then, he has worked with Across Boundaries as case manager and team lead until 2021. And currently, he's working as a social worker with Ministry of Solicitor General, and he has extensive experience providing mental health, addiction, and housing support to Black and racialized population in Toronto, and he works predominantly from an ABR perspective. Over to you, AB.
Thank you, Bindu Chechi. Good afternoon, all. I appreciate MASWO for taking bold steps to organizing this event to encourage conversation among Malayali and South Asian communities regarding the importance of being an ally with our Black community in their ongoing struggle for equality and social justice, especially using the resisting anti-Black racism movements. Before I start, I have to acknowledge and share my social location and privilege. I'm a South Asian male, heterosexual, educated Christian, belongs to a middle-class family, enjoyed a lot of privileges while in India, and thrived in a society that promoted negative stereotypes and prejudices towards indigenous people, people who are at the lower strata of the caste system, certain religious groups. And when my geographical location changed due to the migration, certain aspects of my social location and privileges have changed, but my prejudices and biases were still there. I will be talking this presentation based on my critique about anti-Black racism, as well as how, as a South Asian male, promoted anti-Black racism and how I encountered anti-Black racism while I was working as a social worker or case manager. In 2014, I completed the ISW program, which provided some understanding of anti-oppressive and anti-racism practices. Often, I struggle to grasp the perspectives due to my orthodox views towards many things, especially towards the Black community. I believe that people are responsible for their life situation or are given equal opportunities, and it is up to people to use those opportunities to succeed in their lives.
I, knowingly or unknowingly, promoted stereotypes, biases, and prejudices about Black people, though I did not have any evidence to substantiate those. We often say that Black people are less family oriented. Most of them are single parents, more aggressive, criminals, loud, and prone to substance use. That is why Black people are overrepresented in Canada's criminal justice and child welfare system. As we strive hard to be a model minority to please the colonizers and fit into the existing oppressive system, we are hesitant to look into the Black people's issues from a social justice perspective. As a case manager, I worked mostly with the Black adult people in Toronto. My work allowed me to reflect on my implicit biases, judgments, and stereotypes towards the Black people and the Black community. I have to unlearn and relearn many things in my life to work with the Black people. My attitude towards Blackness, my religious and orthodox views, which directly or indirectly contribute to the anti-Black racism. At the beginning of my work, I was very apprehensive about visiting Black service users alone in their apartment or houses, mainly due to my prejudices towards Black people, especially those with the mental health and substance use issues. It took a while for me to realize that my fears were baseless and such assumptions were made based on my stereotypical thinking of Black people. Further reading, resisting anti-Black racism trainings, open conversation with my Black coworkers and service users, and self-reflective practices helped me to overcome such biases to a certain extent. To be honest, still, at times I struggle with anti-Black racism. I have to admit that at the same time, I never had any such safety concerns when visiting non-Black service users. There are many ways to see whether we promote anti-Black racism. What I do is constant self-reflection on my social location, implicit biases, aware of microaggressions, self-reflective practices, and open conversation with the Black people and community. Who we prefer to choose as our friends at our workplace, friend circle, where we choose to live, how we feel when we see the presence of Black people in our neighborhood, whether we would rent a place to live in a predominantly Black neighborhood. These are all questions we should ask our South Asian or especially Malayali community to check about our biases towards Black community. A key component of resisting the anti-Black racism movement is pointing out it or say it when we see it or challenge it and change and work to change it. Unfortunately, we try to exclude ourselves from such situations, fears that such intervention would damage or try to become a model minority as set by the colonial masters. Naming and challenging racism often result in tension. I remember incidents where people become emotional and agitated when challenged on their anti-Black racism. People would say that I have so many Black friends. I never experienced any issues while interacting with them. For me, having Black friends and being racist are entirely different things. I have seen my Black service users and colleagues experiencing anti-Black racism while looking for a place to live in Toronto. Many times, landlords rejected leasing applications after seeing the Black person just because of their skin color. I do not think they would do the same thing to a white person or a brown person. It took almost 9 months for one of my colleagues with a stable income and good credit history to find an apartment in Toronto. If that is the case of someone with a stable income, imagine how challenging it would be a Black person who is on social assistance and dealing with mental health challenges to secure a place to live. From my experience, I can say that my Black service users were subject to severe anti-Black racism from the building managers from the South Asian backgrounds. In order to overcome such rejection, I would ask my Black services to dress up and abstain from smoking while going for a unit viewing. Later, I started thinking about my actions, questioned myself, asking why I'm not asking my other service users to dress up. I would say that my implicit biases contributed to such actions. Recently, while talking with a friend about one of my managers, I told my friend that my manager is Jamaican, but she's nice. Why would I say that? I reflected about that. After working all these years with the Black people, having so much exposure to resisting anti-Black racism, I reflected on my statement and shared my feelings with my friend. I believe my statements come from the prejudices that Jamaicans are arrogant and aggressive. Another instance where I was showing an appreciation card to my colleagues sent by one of my service users. I remember showing the card to all the people in the lounge, except the only Black person who was an admin staff. When going out of the lounge, the Black person called and questioned me for not showing her the card. I didn't have an answer, felt offended. Instead of arguing with her, I reflected on my action. I realized that that could be an instance of anti-Black racism where I dismissed the presence of a Black person. I had a conversation with the person and talked about the feelings and apologized to her for discriminating against her. I can certainly say that I would have shown that card to other admin staff who is a Filipino. Questions about Black people's credibility, truthfulness, genuineness, qualifications are often a common discussion and concern in a racist society. Overrepresentation of Black people in Canada's criminal justice and child welfare system stems from the prejudices and biases towards Black people. I have seen situations where police, child welfare, and criminal justice systems dismisses Black people's credibility that led to harsher actions and punishments when it's compared to a white person with the same situation, in the same situation. Constantly reflecting of our implicit biases, being aware of how our actions, belief systems, prejudices contribute to the anti-Black racism, and having a clear understanding of how we promote anti-Black racism in our circles, aware of microaggressions. I would say resisting anti-Black racism and being an ally is an ongoing learning experience, where I always check on my implicit biases and prejudice to reflect on my actions, belief systems, values to identify the anti-Black racism and also share such an experience on learning and relearning. I hope such conversations would encourage further conversation in our communities about the importance of being an ally with the Black communities in their pursuit of equality through resisting anti-Black racism initiatives. As a closing statement, I quote Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Abby, for being so bold and loud about your personal experience and journey in your efforts to minimize racism and oppression. Abby, it takes tremendous courage to be honest, to share your personal experiences with racism, and to have uncomfortable conversations. You seem to be a pro at it. And so thank you once again for being such a good role model for all of us. Yeah, so there's also a message from Baiju to you, Abby. Wow, that was a mighty assertion on your own social location and privilege, not usually heard from Malayalis. Appreciate your deep self-reflective approach in your work, a great example of progressive and critical approach. Appreciate your boldness and courage, Abby. So we have come to the end of this discourse, this discussion. So that was it. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you can share. Use this time to share. We have a few more minutes. So just a message from MASWO committee. Thank you everyone for joining MASWO session. On Black History Month, we will be continuing with various sessions supporting the community. Please stay tuned on MASWO's social media platforms. Thank you and have a great evening and the rest of the day. Yeah. So thank you everyone. If you don't have any questions.